asked me to start off today just by not so much looking into the future or talking about any of these whiz-bang technologies that a lot of us are familiar with, but by trying to give the lay of the land for what we think we know about this intersection of tech progress and jobs and wages so far. And I thought the best way to do that would be in the form that's familiar to a lot of people here, in a FAQ, in a frequently asked questions about technology, jobs, and wages. Because ever since Eric and I started writing about this, I've been getting asked a lot of questions about this topic. So what I wanted to do is try to summarize the most common questions, the most important questions that I get asked regularly, and then my favorite answers and my best answers to those questions. So the first one, pretty obviously, is, all right, what is going on with technology, jobs, and wages? And to oversimplify in a helpful way instead of a harmful way, my answer to that is that the single most important phenomenon for me about the American workforce is that we're seeing a polarization or a hollowing out in that workforce. And I want to draw my favorite graphs that show that hollowing out taking place over time. And there's the great compliment one songwriter can pay another is to say, wow, I wish I had written that one. I think the great geek compliment equivalent is, wow, I wish I had drawn that graph. So this is not my work. This work comes from my MIT colleague, David Otter, who's been doing a lot of really fantastic work to understand changes in the American workforce. And recently, he's turned his attention to some of these automation questions. And I want to show you some of his work and some of his conclusions. He drew this beautiful graph, which I'm going to turn into kind of a cheap animation about what's been going on. And David had the brilliant idea to take all of the jobs in the United States in 1979 and line them up in order from lowest paid to highest paid. And then obviously right there in the middle, you've got that historically large, stable, prosperous American middle class, which I believe is one of the great achievements of our country and our society. So the middle class jobs are right there in the middle. And then David's great idea was to play the movie forward and watch what happens to changes across those income, those wage levels in future years. And so the way he did that is to say, okay, let's look at, for example, what happened over the following decade, 1979 to 1989. And what happened is this, and let me explain what you're looking at here with this line. What David is drawing is where the jobs, the market share, not the volume, but the market share of jobs was lost and where it was gained. Does that make sense? So, pop quiz, is this graph a happy graph or an unhappy graph? Unhappy. This is a really happy graph, right? We are losing lousy jobs in America. We're creating relatively fewer low-paid jobs, and then you see the American middle class and the upper middle class are doing quite well over the period 1979 to 1989. And so we're seeing the expansion, the enrichment of the American middle class, and we're destroying a lot of fairly lousy jobs down low. And then things for me start to get really interesting in later time periods, because you look from 89 to 99, and all right, and a little flattening going out there right in the middle, and there's that tail down there on the left side, which is growing and kind of scary. We're creating a lot of deeply lousy jobs, low-paid jobs there. If you play the tape forward one more decade, this is where things start for me to get pretty ugly, because we're doing a great job from 99 to 2007, before the Great Recession kicked in. We're doing a great job of creating deeply lousy lower middle class and lower class jobs. And then the rest of it is kind of flatlining. And to the extent there is relative job loss, it's right there in the middle. And then the most recent years that David graphed shows the resurgence of the upper middle class, the top 80, the top 90%. We start to see that those jobs come back, but the hollowing out of the middle class is just as obvious as it can possibly be. And we see that the engine of American job creation has pretty clearly shifted into a lower gear, and we're creating lots of those low-class jobs and those lower middle-class jobs. There are lots of different ways to visualize this hollowing out of the middle class. David's work for me is my favorite way to do that, and he has really solidified this notion that there is a polarization taking place. The follow-on question that I get asked a lot is, okay, is this just a United States phenomenon, or are we seeing it more broadly? And it's not just a US-only phenomenon. Here's a similar situation graphed for a lot of European countries, all relatively wealthy countries. And each country here has 3 columns: low-paid jobs, middle-paid jobs, high-paid jobs. And again, we're graphing the market share changes in each of those 3 categories over a pretty decently long time period. And you see, without exception, across these countries, the jobs are being lost in the middle. And then there's a mix in whether we're gaining up high or down low, but this hollowing out of the middle class is a really, really pervasive phenomenon. The next question that I get asked all the time, like you can imagine, is, okay, isn't this because of China? Isn't this a phenomenon of globalization? And it is partially a phenomenon of globalization, but I meet a lot of people who think that's the entire story, and I just don't agree with that. Exactly because of the graph that Moshe stole from me already earlier today, I want to redraw that graph of American value added in manufacturing over time versus total employment in American manufacturing over time. So that's our manufacturing output. And to echo Moshe, anyone who tells you about the decline in American manufacturing does not really know what they're talking about. It is true that China has surpassed us as the world's largest manufacturer. We are number 2. Our manufacturing industry is larger than that of Germany, the UK, and India combined. Our manufacturing industry is larger than the GDP of Italy. We are a manufacturing powerhouse, as you can see, growing over time. But when you cross that with total employment in manufacturing, you see a productivity story, you see an automation story, you see a technology story. The only way that we add more and more value over time while employing fewer and fewer people is by progressively automating more and more of the factory. And I think a lot of us have probably walked around cutting-edge manufacturing facilities, and you see a few people around the periphery largely solving problems that brought up by the amazing amounts of automation in these factories. So globalization is another tectonic force that's reshaping the workforce. It is absolutely not the only story in town. All right, so what is the root cause here? Again, I'm going to rely on work that David Otter and a colleague did. David is not a technology scholar, and so I'm going to outsource my answer to him because I see technology under every rock, and I really want to hear from somebody who doesn't look at the world inherently that way. So in work that David did about this polarization, he said, look, the cause is pretty clear here. It's that we are automating, we have been automating the routine stuff in our economies. And the thing to keep in mind is that that large, stable, prosperous American middle class was built on the back of routine work. The average American worker, that 50th percentile American worker today does not have a college education. We are minority college educated, has never had a college education. So these are less educated people doing lots of routine work. And you can think about routine physical work, that's an assembly line worker in a factory, or routine cognitive work, that's the payroll clerk inside that same factory. We already have technologies that are really good at both of those categories of routine work. So look, if you're doing the same thing over and over every day, it doesn't matter if it's physical work or cognitive work, we have had digital technologies, we've had automation for a while that is good at doing that work, and that's what's causing the hollowing out. David says we've looked at other causes. We've looked at immigration, we've looked at globalization, we've looked at lots of things. They are not the central actor here. They're not the main cause about what's going on. It brings up another question is, okay, if there's been this progressive hollowing out and lots of automation and employment being driven downward in absolute terms in industries like manufacturing, why don't we see massive unemployment? And the answer for me is that when you grow the economy and when you have a flexible labor force, that 1-2 punch means that you don't lose jobs in aggregate. So let me try to break that down a little bit. This is a graph purely of GDP, like how big is the economy? Is it growing over time or not? And then that bottom line is the raw number of jobs in the economy. And the relationship could not be clearer, could not be tighter. As you grow a modern economy, even a very technologically sophisticated one like America's, you need labor to grow that economy. This graph is the best refutation of anyone who says that we are anywhere near peak labor in the economy. As the economy grows, we add more jobs, we add more hours worked, and it's an extremely tight relationship that doesn't show any signs of massively decoupling yet. In addition to which, as we grow the economy, we also in America benefit from a very flexible labor force, a very flexible labor environment. You can move jobs fairly easily. There's not a lot of regulatory barriers getting in the way of redeploying people from one job to another. So you don't see massive stagnant pools of unemployment. You see just reallocation going on. Unfortunately, to redraw that line from earlier, we see reallocation these days from here, from that classic middle, down low, down to the lower middle class and the lower middle class. Again, Moshe's industrial espionage was fantastic. He stole another one of my favorite slides, which is to point out that even though the headline unemployment rate is quite low, is very, very low, and we have a very dynamic workforce, there is still a concentrated pocket and area where we do see pretty serious unemployment. And again, to echo Moshe, this is because the unemployment statistic only includes you if you have a job or are looking for a job. If you've opted out of the workforce altogether, if you're just sitting on the sidelines of the workforce, you are not included in that unemployment statistic. And the number and the percentage of people who are opting out is big, and until at least very recently, it's actually been growing. So here is, again, the decline in prime age male labor force participation. This is a bizarre and kind of scary trend. These are exactly the people who have historically been the most employed people, the backbone of the labor force, are prime age men, and they're sitting out in larger and larger numbers. One slide I think I included at the last minute, so Moshe could not steal it, but he alluded to it, was the breakdown in this people sitting on the sidelines by educational attainment. And it tells exactly the story that you would expect. There has been very, very little drop-off among college graduates. But if you look at people who have a high school education or even less than that, we are now at the point where 1 in 5 of them, essentially, are sitting out of the economy. As far back as we have data, we have never, ever been here before. I really can't tell an optimistic or a positive story about this trend. So the question that comes up after you kind of absorb this data for a while is, okay, what does this imply? What are the consequences of this? And I want to be very clear. I'm going to show you some data about some social phenomena that are happening in America. I do not want to draw a direct line and only one line between technological progress and all these things that we're about to see. Economists love to talk about causal density, which is a fancy way of saying there are a lot of things going on here. So I just want to reiterate that I'm not trying to draw a simple relationship or a one-to-one relationship at all. There are a lot of things going on these days. So with that caveat, I want to show you a couple things that we're also observing that I think are kind of scary and present some real challenges to us. As these other trends have been going on, we have become aware just in the past couple of years of a pretty dire phenomenon, an increase in mortality among exactly the groups that we've been talking about. And the reason it took us so long to become aware of this is because mortality has been declining. Death rates have been going down for almost any group that you could identify or that you would think about anywhere in the world. It's an incredibly positive story. Death rates are going down. All age levels, all geographies, all income levels, no matter where you look, until Ann Case and Angus Deaton highlighted in a 2015 paper that, wait a minute, that's actually not uniformly true. And they had the idea to segregate out prime age American people by ethnicity. And the good news is for African Americans and Hispanics, the death rates continue to go down. This is not news. We knew death rates were going down. For white middle-aged Americans, the death rates were actually climbing upward. This is a big reversal of the previous trend. When they went and looked at it by cause, they found that the one that was skyrocketing was death from alcohol and drug poisoning. People are poisoning themselves, they're overdosing. The other ones they identified were suicide and chronic liver disease. So people are killing themselves quickly and slowly, and that was enough to cause this overall rise in white middle-aged mortality. People have quibbled with their exact findings, but the broad one, unfortunately, the broad one has been holding up extraordinarily well, to the point that as of this year, deaths from overdose are the prime cause of death for Americans under 50. I find that astonishing, and anyone who can tell a happy story about that, more power to you. This is a scary, scary trend. The loss of life from the opioid epidemic is already greater, I think greater by a lot, than the total loss of life in America from the AIDS epidemic. This is not a small deal, and we do not see it plateauing yet. So these deaths of despair and the epidemic are a real phenomenon and a challenging one. There's also some really interesting and, again, troubling data about what I call social decay, or a fraying of things and a decline in positive behavior and social capital, that I find really striking. And the person, to my eyes, who's done the best job of capturing this is Charles Murray, who does really careful work to dive into social statistics in America. He wrote a book a couple years back called Coming Apart, where he looked at the state of white America. And the reason he focused himself on white America was he was kind of tired of getting called a racist. He'd focused earlier on problems in the African American community. He got really called out on that. So he said, okay, fine, I'm just gonna look at white Americans. And he divided them into two categories. Think of that as upper middle class Americans and lower middle class Americans. And he characterized them as living in two different towns. We are sorting ourselves geographically. So Murray said, okay, I'm gonna create a fictional town called Belmont, where essentially not richest Americans, but upper middle class Americans live. And I'm gonna create a town called Fishtown, where lower middle class Americans live. I'm gonna show you what's been happening in Belmont versus Fishtown for about the past half century. So, for example, and his overall narrative is that the situation in those two communities has diverged in a really striking way. Belmont still lives like Belmont did back in the Eisenhower administration, or the Leave It to Beaver era. Fishtown is not. So, for example, this is the percentage of families that are divorced or separated. There's been a little uptick in Belmont, and then we held steady. Fishtown, the divorce rates keep skyrocketing. This means that the percentage of kids who are living with two parents when the mom is 40 has been plummeting in Fishtown. It's now way south of 40% in Fishtown. The majority of kids are not raised in two-parent homes. This is what's been happening in the prisons. There's not a heck of a lot more white-collar crime as far as we can tell, but Fishtown is sending a lot of people to prison. And it leads to another interesting dynamic that's going on, which is nicely captured by the title of this book, The Politics of Resentment. This was a sociologist in Wisconsin who, even before the 2016 election kicked in, went into some of the rural communities in a pretty progressive state in Wisconsin and identified this kind of festering resentment. She was trying to understand how Scott Walker became governor of Wisconsin. And she went to these smaller communities and she just identified this resentment against fill in the blank, against immigrants who jumped the queue, against elites in their coastal cities who were snubbing people, hardworking rural Americans, against the government which is stacking the deck against them, against professionals like university professors and doctors and lawyers who were supercilious and cheating them out of everything. And she just identified this kind of seething resentment. I say it again, before the 2016 election kicked in and proved her an absolute oracle as far as I'm concerned. So I see a lot of these things, and combined with the demographic trends and the mortality trends, when Moshe and I go to these conferences, there's a contingent there who is deeply and sincerely worried about the Terminator. And I mean that in all seriousness. They're worried about existential risk from AI. And they think, to repeat Elon Musk, they believe we're summoning the demon. So when I presented to them some of this data earlier this year, I threw a caution up there based on these trends that I've just put up there. And I said, gang, if current trends continue, the people are going to rise up way before the machines do. That was my best prediction. I think we're seeing some evidence of a populist uprising or of pretty serious discontent. My exhibit A for that is this picture, which is of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and Nigel Farage, who was one of the leading forces behind the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. This to me is very clear evidence that a lot of people are deeply, deeply unhappy with the status quo that has brought us to this point. The last couple things I want to touch on are things going to get better? And this is where the debate to me gets really fascinating, because there are two very strongly opposed views here without a lot of overlap between them. One is, hey, look, we are underestimating the power of markets and innovation and capitalism and free enterprise and free trade to fix this situation. They say, look, if you're worried about all the jobs going away or everything getting dire, you're joining this 200-year-old litany of people predicting massive technological unemployment and being dead flat wrong about it. That includes the Luddites, it includes Marx, it includes John Maynard Keynes, who's one of my intellectual heroes, and things just got better for most people very consistently over time. So this is the kind of the market forward pro-capitalism view, which has the weight of history behind it, saying we might need to change some things in our policy environment, but if we play our hand right, we can see a continuation of solid prosperity and income gains like we've been seeing for the entire industrial era. The other side of that argument says, nope, this time is actually different. And what we're underestimating is not the power of capitalism, we're underestimating the power of technology, and in particular, the bundle of technologies that we have in front of us at present that can do things that technology could never, ever do before. Recognize patterns better than human beings, understand our speech and figure out what we want and give it back to us. And this world of autonomous vehicles and powerful machine learning systems, this is not like anything that has come before. This time is different, and these trends are likely to exacerbate and accelerate instead of reverse themselves almost no matter what we do. The last question I want to spend a bit of time on is, okay, regardless of which of those two things you believe, what should we do? And I want to end with a visualization that I'm actually really ashamed of, because it's astonishingly unscientific and biased and idiosyncratic, but at least it's a Venn diagram, so that's cool. I want to draw a Venn diagram of suggested interventions or policy changes identified by the communities that come up with them, so politicians, economists, and technologists. It's amazingly enough, it's not quite the null, it's the null set of action, not of recommendation. So with that really important caveat, there are a few politicians advocating trade wars. Nobody else is advocating that. Some politicians get a little bit closer to some categories of economists who say, look, a higher minimum wage will increase incomes without having bad employment consequences. There's controversy about that. Some technologists would love lower income taxes, so that idea of lowering income taxes and unleashing the forces of growth that way has some popularity. Some politicians and lots of economists are big fans of an expansion in the current negative income tax, or the earned income tax credit. There's a lot of support behind that. There's a technology community that says, no, instead of monkeying with things like the EITC, let's just get ready for the era where there aren't any jobs, and let's start thinking about a universal basic income for folk. At the intersection of technologists and economists, those two groups think that there is opportunity to get some burdensome regulation out of the way, particularly with things like occupational licensing, which really does seem to impede people's ability to move to a new place and move to a new job. And while there's an anti-immigrant or immigration sentiment among some politicians, technologists and economists are deeply aligned on the notion that, man, when the world's most ambitious and tenacious people want to come to your country to build their careers, you should probably let them. And then, Vint, what is in that intersection? Is it the null set or not? Not quite. All three groups at least talk about upgrading our infrastructure, whether or not we're spending that money. And everyone says we need to reform education. There's just not great consensus about how or great momentum to do it yet. Let me stop there. I think Moshe, do we have a couple seconds for questions, or do I need to get off?
No.
Sir? Thank you. Can you wait for a microphone so we can get it on the stream, please?
The one thing you don't talk about is
Yeah, exactly.
Well, it depends if you're using technologies, politicians, or economists.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Ever since Murray and Gerstein, we don't talk about IQ anymore. Could that be the problem? I mean, we're sending 30% of our population to college.
So I'm sorry, I don't hear the question.
The question is the problem really that IQ, we just don't have the people who are intelligent enough to fill the jobs we need?
I don't think that's the problem at all. The job growth, like we've seen, is down in jobs that don't require super high IQ as we measure it. I think there's a lot of potential to create good old-fashioned middle-class jobs like health coach, which might require good interpersonal skills, don't require 2 standard deviations upward IQ. So I'm not worried that we're not smart enough, all of us, for the jobs of the future. I'm worried about the skill misalignment and some of the policy things that are getting in our way of trying to let that engine of job creation kick back up into a higher gear. Is over here?
Yeah, so I'm Alfred Spector. I've been talking a lot about data science and all of the great opportunities we have in learning correlations from all of the data. But if we look to epidemiologists over the years and look at even things that look like there's probable causality, they have been wrong so many times, as all of us know, by looking at the FDA regulation suggestions on food to do. And some of the studies that have been done, all of us in this room would conclude causality, I think, as they did, and they turned out to be incorrect. For example, hormone replacement for women. We all would have probably fallen down that. In this one here, there's a lot of implication in the early talks, although everyone says that they're not saying this for sure, but there's a lot of implication here that it's technology which is the root cause, and it may very well be. But I just wanted to list a few other things that we really need to understand fully before we can conclude this. So one is there's a huge growth in women in the workforce in this period of time. We're seeing statistics on males, not women. And when there's a large growth in the workforce, there may be rational reasons why men can actually relax and not work as much. For example, I'm not an economist, I'm just saying there are many factors here. The second is there has been a very significant growth during many of the periods that you report in college education. And when you might expect that that would lead to growth in college-educated salaries versus others. There's aging. Some of the statistics you show clearly do not look at that when you're looking at a certain group. But overall workforce participation is often discussed without reference to aging. It's part of it. Decline of unions, the growth of imports is clearly there. You say that, but you say you don't think it's the whole thing. I would agree, but it's a big part of it. There's a growth in non-measured income that is not often discussed. So if we look at measured income, that's one thing, but we didn't look at the decline in unmeasured income when women went into the workforce and stopped raising children. We're also not looking at the value of all the materials that are available for free now on the web and all the other labor-saving things that are going on. There are many more, actually. I don't want to take 20 minutes and give a talk on this, because that would be impolite. But there's so many of them that I think we truly need to understand the impact of all of the factors, as some economists have looked at, but probably there isn't time in most of the presentations today, before we really conclude the impact of technology on this effect of disparity in salary growth.
Yeah, 2 points on that. Number one, I tried to say a couple different times that there are a lot of things going on here. Our best read of the current research, as I look at the research out there, by people like David Otter and others, says that even controlling for some of the factors that you mentioned, tech progress is a causal factor in the phenomena that I'm talking about.
Last one.
Thank you. I'm David Nordfors. I work with Vint here on initiative we call I4J, Innovation for Jobs. And I just think that maybe, things are getting very complicated. Maybe we're asking the wrong question. So in the economy, we ask the question, what's the most cost-efficient way these people can do this thing? But if we instead ask, what's the most value these people can create in any possible way, that's of course going to give a higher result. So if we go from move focus from lowering the cost of things to increasing the value of people, and have that as the business idea, I think one solves a whole lot of things, because what's more, increasing the value of people, that they get more valuable for each other, scales macroeconomically, because then companies who do that say, I earn my money by helping other people help each other earn money. But if you have innovation that is for spending, not for earning, and this is what we have today, you say, I earn my money by helping other people get rid of each other. And that does not scale. So, but the problem is that economics, the mathematics and the whole science of economics, is very much focused on what is, rather than, or what we know could be, rather than what we don't know could be. Finding the real new radical solutions for people to need each other more. So, you know, I'm going to quit now, yeah. Sure. But anyway, I just want to point out in your first book...
So that was neither brief nor a question.
No, sorry.
But thank you. So let me try to respond to that. It's true that over-relying on economics gets us into trouble. Also, ignoring it gets us into trouble, because there are some aspects of it that, come closer to me like to the laws of physics than things that we might like to have happen. So if you jump out of a window and expect to fly, you're ignoring the laws of physics and you're going to suffer the consequences. If you go too far toward this notion that we just need to be helping each other out and creating value and everything else will fall into place, I think you get into a similar kind of trouble. My exhibit A for this is the job of home health aide, which everyone here would agree is an enormously societal, valuable job. So why isn't that a high-paid job? Why don't we make that a great job? There are two pretty serious reasons why not. Number one is that it's a low productivity job. That person is spending a great deal of time in the company of exactly one other human being. I don't mean it's a low value job, to use your term. It's a low productivity job. Low productivity goes along with low pay. The other thing is, while that there's no robot in the world today or on the drawing board that would be a good home health aide, there are lots of people who have the skills to do that task. So it's not a scarce skill set. So again, competition among people drives down wages. Ignoring either of those things is not a smart thing to do. And I'm interested in policy interventions that might be able to help increase the income of a home health aide without just mandating that we pay them $30 an hour, which will put them outside the range of most households in the United States. Thanks very much.
Thank you.